Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. I'm joined again by Terminal Philosophy. We're taking a bit of a detour from our chronological discussion of military history to the first known alternative counterfactual history in history, Livy's account of a fictional invasion of Alexander the Great of Italy. So let's first define our terms. What is alternative history or speculative history? Beginning around recently in the 90s, but this actually goes back as a trend to the early 20th century. Winston Churchill famously wrote one about what if Lee had lost at Gettysburg. It's an alternative history. He's assuming Lee won, and then is writing from the position, what if Lee lost, which is actually really fascinating. But the point is, though, it's an exercise to attempt to determine, to show us how important historical cause and effect is. Because if we take an event, control for that event, and pretend it didn't happen or went another way, we can begin to guess and speculate about how history might have developed in a different direction. But what that does is it helps reinforce in the minds of the people doing this how important the events actually are. Now, a lot of historians don't like the idea because they say it's just, playing games and it's a fairy tale. I mean, yes, none of this is actually real, but the purpose of it is to highlight and emphasize the importance of actual historical events and how they can affect other historical events centuries or even a millennium down the road. Now, we mentioned in the Life of Pyrrhus that Plutarch states the Romans bragged that they could have beat Alexander the Great had he invaded Italy. And when Pyrrhus invades, one of the Roman senators shames them and says, you were boasting you could beat Alexander. Now you want to treat with Pyrrhus, which put some iron on their back, and they decided to keep fighting. So what Livy is saying, he's writing like 200 years before Pyrrhus, is sort of an extension of that Roman attitude. And really, it does take some, cojones to say that, to diss Alexander the Great. I guess only the Romans could really get away with that. So this is sort of just framing the point of what is alternative history, why Livy's doing this within the context of a sort of Roman national epic. He's, saying that Romans are the best. We could have defeated Alexander. It's sort of like the great what if. The Romans had conquered the world at this point, and everybody was like, yeah, the Romans are great, but you know what? You couldn't. Alexander would have beaten you. And it was kind of like bugging the Romans. They're like, nah, we got to square this away. We got to prove that we could have beaten Alexander because we beat everybody else. So as it's sort of just laying out what an alternative history is, do you have anything to say about that terminal philosophy?
Right. Well, as far as I'm aware, this is the first alternate historical publication in history. I'm sure there was a lot of pontificating from other historians of the time and possibly earlier about which king or country would have conquered another if the historical circumstances were different. It's clear after reading this portion of Book 9 of Livy's History of Rome that he clearly favors Rome over Alexander in this scenario. Now, that's not to say that he was just trashing on Alexander and his conquest of Persia, but after I read this and thought about it, I sort of had three initial thoughts. One is that Livy's Roman bias may be too intense for this scenario. Specifically, I mean that during Alexander's conquest into Asia, Rome was not yet the powerhouse that everyone typically thinks of when Rome is brought up in conversation. Most people think about depictions of Rome from the movie Gladiator or something like that, where Rome is this vast and wealthy empire. But at this point in history, their tactics were not as refined. And in this scenario, the maniple formation was not quite yet adopted. Say, for example, that Alexander, instead of dying in Babylon in 323, he rests and recuperates from his long conquest of Persia and the Punjab region and the Indus River Valley, replenishes his ranks, and then heads west for Italy. Let's just put his theoretical amphibious landing somewhere in some place like Magna Graecia, let's say like 325. Well, the maniple system, this initial formation for which made Rome such a regional threat, was not yet fully adopted until 343 in the Samnite Wars. Now, that's not to say that Rome couldn't have adapted to Alexander's phalanx and cavalry tactics, but I think it's true to say that Alexander's army was a much more formidable enemy than, say, someone like people like the Volscians or the Samnites. Another thought I had was that depending on the tribal conditions of Italy during this alternate invasion of Rome, it's difficult to say whether or not all of these warring tribes and mini states would have just all of a sudden formed a coalition to fight back against Alexander. I think it's likely that powers like the Samnites or another tribe would rather see Rome struggle and deplete its men against an enemy like Alexander rather than face years of war against Rome in the future. It might be a bit of a stretch for Livy to think that Rome would be joined by its neighbors to fight Alexander because of, these states have been killing each other for well over a century at this point. And, at this point in Rome's expansion, they, could they have really dealt with Alexander's elephants and veteran phalanx and cavalry either by themselves or with these neighboring allies? I don't know. It's tough to say outright for me. And then a third point I'll say is that, which this actually sort of favors Livy's writing, because I want to be as fair and just sort of analytical as possible. Alexander, I guess one of the reasons why Alexander, kicked the Persians' asses so bad was because of tactics and formations. You and I have often talked at length about this sort of lackluster quality of Persia's armies. The reason why Persia suffered militarily was a failure to create quality men and formations. Many Persia's, I would say, many Persian armies were so, multilingual, and the soldiers who made up these enormous armies were seen as slaves or subjects, and rather than a citizen or like an individual, a part of a greater state, which they were able to have some sort of stake in their society. India's armies from Punjab suffered from this as well, but they had hundreds of elephants against Alexander, so there's that. But although Alexander was often, he was often outnumbered by the Persians in battle, the variety of tactics, such as like the hammer and anvil, as well as the discipline and quality of the phalanx, meant that Persia could no longer rely on simply outnumbering an opponent. They could send thousands of men at the Greeks, but because the Greeks had an answer for everything Persia was throwing at it, the Persians were ultimately, just in a retrospect, not nearly as formidable as an opponent as Rome would likely have been against Alexander. Now, of course, the Pyrrhic War is a decent frame of reference for this sort of scenario. The Romans did suffer some defeats, but this, of course, was much later when Rome was the decisive power in Italy. They also made quick adjustments of how to fight against elephants. And Pyrrhus got himself into a bit of trouble as well by sort of marching into the far west regions of Sicily and fighting Carthage as well. I think had Pyrrhus focused his efforts in Magna Graecia, we might have had a few more examples of how Greeks and Romans would have adjusted their tactics and strategy against one another, at least for that time. I think ultimately that what is likely in this scenario is that if Rome and Alexander were to go to war, Alexander may not have fully conquered Rome, but Rome would offer treaties after several costly minor victories or potential outright defeats. Alexander would have likely seen the potential in Rome as a regional ally or some kind of vassal state, and a place of some kind of a place of potential, figuratively speaking. I don't know that either Rome or Alexander would just annihilate the other so easily. But for the time being, for now, I ultimately favor Alexander for the reasons I had laid out. And I think one last thing I'll say here is that Carthage sure makes for an interesting variable here. Depending on Alexander's theoretical invasion of Rome, would he fight Carthage before, during, or after this potential conquest of Rome? Would Rome have pleaded to the Carthaginians for help? Could Carthage have done anything against Alexander in a meaningful way? It's possible, but again, by 323, Rome just wasn't quite this regional badass like it was much later when Pyrrhus was trying to be the next Alexander. I don't know. It's just such an interesting part of Livy's writing. I'll hand it back to you.
So if we look at Livy's broad argument here, the broad argument is that system defeats excellent individuals. And there's two parts, there's two quotations that I think indicate Livy's point of view here. In paragraph 19 of Book 9, he starts, it remains that the forces be compared together with respect to their numbers, the quality of the men, and the supply of the auxiliaries. Now, in the general surveys of the age, they were rated 250,000 men, so that on every revolt of the Latin Confederates, 10 legions were enlisted almost entirely in the city levy. Okay, so again, if Alexander invades in 325, that's roughly around the time of when the Second Samnite War is, I think, ongoing. So I don't know what the Samnites and the Romans would do at that point. I think the Samnites would likely patch things up with the Romans because a large Greek army invading Samnium would be something they couldn't handle if they were fighting the Romans. But so yeah, we have around 250,000 Roman forces, right? At this point, this is after the Latin War. The Latins are fully integrated into the Roman force. He speculates that Alexander the Great might have had around, I think, 30,000 soldiers of his Macedonian troops, and if it was any larger, it would have been augmented by, Asiatic auxiliaries. Now, I agree with Livy's thought that the Asiatic auxiliaries would be useless. They would be. The question is how effective would have been the Macedonian core troops. For example, the would-be silver shields, the companion cavalry. Those are the men that would really pose a threat. But what he says here about Alexander, he says, Alexander, if overcome in one battle, would have been overcome in war. The Romans, whom Claudium, whom Cannae did not crush, what line of battle could crush? In truth, every sort of events have been favorable at first to him. He would have wished for the Persians, the Indians, and the effeminate tribes of Asia as opponents, and would have acknowledged that his wars had been waged with women, as we are told was said by King Alexander, king of Epirus, after receiving a mortal wound when comparing the wars he waged in Asia by his very youth with those in which he himself had been engaged. Indeed, when I reflected on the First Punic War, contest was maintained by the Romans and Carthaginians at sea for 24 years, I could scarcely suppose that the life of Alexander would have been long enough for the finishing of one war, with either of those nations. And perhaps as both the Punic state united to the Roman by ancient treaties, and as similar apprehensions might arm against the common foe of those two nations, the most potent of time in arms and men, he might have been overwhelmed in a Punic-Roman war at once. Okay, so this is important here. The first claim he's making is institutions beat individuals. He's right. Hannibal lost to the Romans. The real question here is, was the Roman institutional structure strong enough in the 320s to have that kind of staying power and being able to resist an attack by Alexander or another great power? That's an open question. I think what we could assume, though, is that while the Greek city-states of Magna Graecia would probably view Alexander as a liberator, he had the whole Pan-Hellenism mentality when he went east. So going west, he would probably invoke the same principle that his father did. But the other Italian tribes who were fiercely independent, I could easily see fighting Alexander because, you're not coming into our territory. And again, the real question is Livy correct in assuming the Roman institutions were strong enough to suffer, 2, 3, 4 defeats against Alexander the Great like they did against Hannibal? The other thing he points out is Carthage. And Rome and Carthage were united by treaty. And in part, this treaty pressure between Rome and Carthage helped contain and repel Pyrrhus. Now, neither one could directly beat Pyrrhus in a battle until right at the very end at Beneventum, when Rome defeats Carthage or Pyrrhus in 275. It was that united pressure which helped bring down Pyrrhus. Now, you add up another good question. Is Alexander going to attack Carthage first, or is Alexander going to attack Italy first? Let's start with Carthage. There are two ways Alexander could have attacked Carthage. He could have marched on land through the Libyan desert, essentially, when we covered the campaigns of Agathocles, there was a Greek Cyrenian captain who marched across the Libyan desert to meet up with Agathocles in Tunisia, or come by sea. And of course, Agathocles came by sea. That's two problems for Alexander the Great. The Persians had the most powerful navy in the Mediterranean, full stop, and centuries of naval experience. Alexander had none of that. Now, we do know from the wars of the Diadochi that he was building a large fleet, and the reason why apparently the Ptolemies and the Antigonids just have these huge fleets of quinqueremes out of nowhere is because, they were being built by Craterus in Cilicia. So, yes, they would have been available, but would they have been on par with Carthage? And to be honest, if a huge Macedonian navy's coming in, I think even Syracuse would be like, hey, Carthage, let's bury the hatchet. So if you have a combined Carthaginian, Syracusan naval presence, both of whom have quinqueremes and quadremes and superior naval handling, I think there'd be a decisive naval engagement somewhere around Sicily or North Africa, which would be a Macedonian disaster. I don't think they would have what it takes to defeat Carthage, or singly or in conjunction with Syracuse. Furthermore, any march through the Libyan desert would have to be shadowed by the fleet. The problem is Alexander couldn't do that. When he marched through the Judocian desert in Persia, the fleet of the Indus got lost, and he lost a huge portion of his army crossing that desert. There was supposed to be a Macedonian fleet shadowing his army so that they could receive food and supplies. So Alexander was completely incapable of doing a joint naval land operation across a desert. So I foresee a march across the Libyan desert being a disaster, either because the ships don't coordinate with the army or because they're defeated at sea. I really don't see Alexander taking Carthage unless he's very, very lucky and does something he hasn't been able to do previously, have a competent naval army operation, which Carthage is excellent at. They've been doing it for 150 years. And Syracuse is excellent at that too. Now, that's if he invades Carthage first. If he invades Rome first, he'll probably do what Pyrrhus did and land somewhere in Magna Graecia. The Romans couldn't contest that. They didn't have the fleet to do that. Now, depending on if Syracuse can get pulled into this, they might try to contest it, but would they singly have enough ships to challenge this large navy Alexander had been building in Cilicia? I don't know. But I think what would have likely happened is after, say, 4 or 5 years of fighting, the Carthaginians and possibly even the Syracusans and the Romans, with what little fleet they had, would have launched an attack on the Carthaginian fleet. And again, probably won, because they had all the advantages in a naval battle. And furthermore, Alexander has demonstrated that he doesn't really have the ability to organize a land-sea joint operation. So could he maintain his troops by sea in the same way that, say, Xerxes did? Xerxes failed to because he lost his navy. Well, if Alexander loses his navy, could he sustain the troops in Italy? Would they just be stuck there? I think the real linchpin here is naval control. And I think that while Alexander might be able to win a lot of land battles, he's not going to win at sea. And if Carthage and Syracuse get involved, at best, the Macedonians will be stuck in Italy, and at worst, they'll die of starvation in the Libyan desert.
Right. You have brought up some good points there. I think, I forget the name of the desert in the southern portion of modern day Iran where Alexander led his troops through. But yes, unfortunately for him, that turned out to be this navigational and logistical disaster. It was just, either because of storms or because of, just the quality of ships at that time. It just was not, it was just poorly coordinated. I think to the broader point, it's absolutely true to say that the Carthaginians certainly have the naval advantage. And, even before Carthage was going to war, in the naval capacity, just for centuries, the Carthaginians more or less come from the Phoenicians, and the Phoenicians, were this trading culture all throughout the Mediterranean from, the Levant all the way to the Rock of Gibraltar. So they're kind of masters of the sea, so to speak. Many people forget that after the collapse of the Bronze Age, that the Phoenicians were partially, if not largely isolated from a lot of this because of these small colonies that were set up throughout the Mediterranean. That their populations weren't big, but it sort of helped them. It was more or less kind of a figurative fortification from this huge collapse from what the academics call the invasions of the sea people. So there's that whole grand tradition of naval navigation and shipbuilding. So I think you're absolutely right to say that any naval engagements that would happen between Alexander and Rome or Alexander and Carthage or both would happen somewhere either in southern Italy or Sicily or close to Tunisia or somewhere on the North African coast. And it's tough to, could the Macedonians really have been up to par with the Carthaginians in naval power? All signs point to Carthage, to be quite honest. One thing I have been curious about is that I'm curious as to whether or not Rome's numbers in men are actually what Livy is reporting. Now, I'm not calling him a liar or anything like that, but I really do wonder, did Rome really have like 250,000 men to really to field into battle? Now, certainly it's possible, but is that, is he counting like the general population of Rome with that at the same time? I don't know. It's tough to say. With the point that you brought up earlier, again, one of his big points is that, yes, institutions and systems tend to beat individuals or, these cult of personality types. Hannibal being one of the, the example that you use. And I think that's definitely true. However, this, I think where things begin to get ambiguous is that, with this whole like pan-Hellenistic worldview that Philip had that was passed down to Alexander, I think depending on the tribe he's fighting, it would potentially be different on a case-by-case basis. You mentioned that, a lot of these mountain tribes, such as the Samnites, are, fiercely independent from any outside forces. And so I think, yes, they would definitely see them as going to war. However, I think one thing that shouldn't be left behind is that these rivalries between places like the Samnites and Rome, or the Volscians in Rome, as well as the Gauls, things like that. These rivalries were fairly intense, and I can see, even during the first Samnite War, or excuse me, the second Samnite War, you saw some of this behavior in some tribes where there wasn't this initial willingness just to go to battle. There was sort of like this pensive behavior to allow one tribe to fight Rome and to see what the results of that are, and then potentially swoop in afterwards if one side's been severely weakened. So I can see that being at play. And I think, Alexander's strengths were really on land. And so he probably would have focused his efforts probably somewhere in Magna Graecia, and likely would have been seen as some type of liberator, because that's how much of the population of Magna Graecia saw Pyrrhus initially, because, Rome at the time was this, while, by that point they had their system down of creating colonies and, delegating a lot of local political power. Some people were happy to be free from Rome, as demonstrated by the Pyrrhus's invasion of southern Italy. So, yeah, it's very difficult to say. I wonder how true those numbers are from Livy. But again, he could be right too. He's really kind of the contemporaneous source for this. So I don't want to, he's kind of our guy in terms of, military analysis at the time, but I wonder if his Roman bias is to the point of where, Rome is just invincible in every possible scenario. I don't know that that's quite true yet, only because of this early nascent state of Rome at the time.
Yeah, there's a few more points to make here. One of the hardest siege that Alexander had was the siege of Tyre. Now, he did effectively defeat Tyre because he peeled off other city-states to supply ships to attack it from land and sea. But one could imagine Carthage, which was so strongly defended that even Agathocles gave up any attempt at a direct assault. How would Alexander maintain the supply lines over the 1,000 or so miles he'd have to besiege Carthage, especially when their fleets could interdict his supply columns and shipments of siege weapons and foodstuffs? That's very difficult to imagine. Furthermore, while Alexander was extremely successful against the Persians and many of his opponents, we need to remember two things. All the ancient historians agree that Alexander did not invade India because of the predominance of their elephants. The battle that he fought with Porus, who had a small amount of elephants, the Nanda Empire had like 4,000. Alexander was like, I'm not touching that. His troops were like, we're not touching that. So he basically conceded that he couldn't handle that issue. So in this case, the elephant in the room is an elephant. And Alexander punted. You're not gonna deal with elephants. He's not invincible. That's why he didn't invade India. His war with the Scythians is inconclusive. At Samarkand, an entire Macedonian column was wiped out by Spitamenes. And so, he did a bunch of scorched earth, and a lot of the Scythians yielded, but some fled into the steppe. And again, it's somewhat inconclusive. Alexander just kept marching because he had to go to India. So in India, he gets checkmated by elephants, and in the steppe, he has inconclusive military engagements with the Scythians. So there are limitations to Alexander's military prowess. Second of all, he has shown no ability to have a joint land-sea operation. Syracuse and Carthage have had well over 100 years to do this. So, and the Persians can't do that very well either, as we saw in the Persian Wars. So I think that what we're talking about is that Alexander the Great would have a very hard time invading Western Europe because he couldn't coordinate all these different factors. And then second of all, how many troops does Rome really have? It's possible Livy's also including allies, like the Latins and other groups. But again, I think if we look at what made Rome so permanent as a force was it just didn't give up. I mean, it's almost like the NRA motto: "You got to take the gun from our cold dead hands." That's sort of how the Romans thought about everything. I mean, at a certain point, you wonder would Alexander just get tired of fighting these guys? They just don't give up. I don't know, but maybe he wouldn't. Also, with Pyrrhus, we do see that there were, at that time, already two formal treaties with Carthage and Rome. The first one going back to 348 BC, where they talk about mutual alliance. And they both agreed not to make peace with Pyrrhus. They both agreed to help each other out against Pyrrhus. And this third treaty, which was used to check Pyrrhus, seems to be an extension of a broader understanding going back to the 340s. So it's reasonable that they would have had the same understanding against Alexander, even more so given the powerhouse that he was. And there's another thing that we have to talk about too. Now that Alexander has built an empire and there's all of this power centered around him, what's going to happen with palace intrigues, coups d'etats, and revolts back in Asia? I mean, what's going to happen if Alexander and the great army moves off to Italy and some satrap decides to revolt? Maybe he claims to be Darius, maybe he's the heir to the Persian kingdom, or maybe he's a Macedonian general that feels like he wasn't properly rewarded for his services or doesn't like Alexander's cosmopolitanism. What happens then? Because we have to remember that in antiquity, there were two broad theories of Alexander's death, one of which we completely discount today, but I think that's based on faulty thinking. One was that he died of exertions and disease, but another was that he was poisoned. In fact, the argument that he was poisoned was so prevalent that his successors tried to bring to justice Aristotle and the Peripatetics, the people who were part of his school, because they believed Aristotle and his students had conspired to assassinate Alexander the Great. That was how seriously people took those charges. So would Alexander the Great have been assassinated? I mean, we all know that the Macedonians and the Greeks did not like his cosmopolitanism. They didn't like the fact that he married Persians. How loyal would they have really been? Would they have really been that loyal in the first place? This isn't the army that starts in 336 BC at Granicus. This is an army that's exhausted of years of fighting. The Silver Shields didn't want to stay in India. They revolted, basically. And as Arrian says, it was Alexander's only defeat. They said, we're not going any further west, or east rather. So we have a problem of internal stability, loyalty of the actually effective soldiers, the Greeks and Macedonians, which is an open question. And also the question of revolts in the empire. So what would that have meant? Because, we've seen throughout history, an emperor or a warlord invades a neighboring region, and then it turns out that all these things happen. And given the fact that when Alexander died, we had the War of the Diadochi, this was a real bubbling cauldron of intrigue and hatred. You wonder, could he have kept it together, especially if he gets stuck in Africa or stuck in Italy?
Right. Of course, there's as you mentioned, the problem of, internal management of all these generals and various personalities. And Arrian and Plutarch both write about how, by the time they're reaching, this Indus River Valley, I mean, they're so far from home, and there's plenty of historical evidence to easily state that, a lot of his men were just exhausted and just frustrated with, the extent of this campaign. I mean, are they going to go all the way into China? I mean, they were ready to go home, basically. And, I think the whole campaign was, I think the entire conquest itself was something like 8 years. It might have been a little bit longer, maybe like 7 or 8 years, something like that, really close to that. But that's just a long time. And so, a lot of these people were missing home. And that's an interesting point. With the number of potentially 250,000 Romans, I'm a little bit skeptical on that, because I mean, now that's getting up to the number of Persian horde numbers. Not to say that's impossible for Rome, because one of the things that made Rome so formidable and difficult to deal with was this ability to raise armies really quickly. And the evidence for that, of course, is with the battles with Pyrrhus. But I mean, that number, I it could be real, but I tend to think that has more to do with Rome's allies, potentially even Rome's general population. I could see something maybe 150,000, or maybe 180,000, but 250,000 is it's almost like Persian levels of hordes. It's not that it's again, not that it's impossible, but I'm a little skeptical on that one. But some of the points that you made earlier, specifically with the naval campaigns between specifically with Carthage, I think, I mean, Alexander would have certainly known something about the Carthaginians, given that these colonies had been around for so long that were set up by the Phoenicians. So, I mean, while there's good examples in the past of the Greeks defeating the Persians at sea, were they on level with the Carthaginians? I don't know, probably not. I think Alexander would probably have focused his efforts mostly on land. And, Pyrrhus initially had gained a lot of supplies from local help and efforts from the populations of Magna Graecia. So that's definitely not a long-term solution, but it's probably something short-term that he would have taken advantage of. But I think it could have eventually gone bad for him if that became some sort of dependency. I do think that, Alexander's use of cavalry in open battle was probably just as good, if maybe not a bit better, than how the Romans were using cavalry at the time. I only say that because just of the veterancy of his cavalry, and, they've had a lot of practice with, the anvil and hammer tactic, which, it's not to say that the Romans couldn't have done something about that, but, these were pretty well-trained men. But, again, this is after, sorry about that, after, going all the way to India. It's would these guys have really wanted to, fight, now an entirely new campaign in Italy? I don't know. It's really tough. But I guess the only thing I'm really going to just maintain some speculation on is this number of, 250,000 troops under Rome's control. Probably 100,000 is true, but, in the same way that some criticize Herodotus for some exaggerations of numbers, it's probably okay to have some sober criticisms of Livy along those same lines. But I really do think that some of the best points I think you brought up that have stuck with me are just, again, the naval quality of Greece versus Carthage, and the logistics. I think, also too, Alexander would have had to find a way to manage these various personalities under, Antigonus and all these other generals. He either would have had to pull a lot of his troops that he stationed in places like, modern day Tajikistan and places like that. He would have had to have brought his all of his Macedonians with them, and these satraps. I mean, who knows how long they'd remain loyal to Macedonia at the time. So, those are just some initial thoughts.
Yeah, no, one more factor before we sort of engage in a speculative campaign is a lot of the sailors in this Macedonian navy would likely be Phoenicians, since he already had used them to take Tyre. But would they be loyal in a war against Carthage?
That's a good question.
One of the problems that Persia had in the Persian Wars was that the Greek sailors, the Egyptian sailors, were not really all that interested in fighting at Salamis. They didn't really put their heart into it because the Greeks were loyal to the Greeks and the Egyptians were like, not my fight. And you know how many of the sailors in Alexander's navy would be like, not my fight. I'm not going to fight fellow Punic peoples. But I think what we can one way to speculate, I think a direct attack on Carthage will come last because I just see the passing the Libyan desert being a disaster, just in light of the Judocian desert debacle. And that was not against an enemy fighting you. If the enemy was fighting you the whole time on land and sea, it would be a catastrophe. I think instead Alexander would do what Pyrrhus did and invade Italy. I think what we could say is somewhere maybe around like Brundisium or something, and he'd probably pursue the same policy of attacking naval bases like he did against the Persia. So he marched down from Asia Minor to Levant to Egypt to cut off the naval bases for the Persian Navy. He'd probably continue that. And then the question is, once he consolidates Magna Graecia, would he attack Sicily to knock out the naval bases there? Because Rome isn't really a naval threat. Or would he march up into the mountainous highlands of the Apennines to fight the Romans and possibly the Samnites? Because we know that Alexander's geostrategic operational mode was to knock out naval bases. Now, that was a lot easier to do in Asia. I don't know how feasible it is in the West. So once he consolidates Magna Graecia, what does he do then? Does he go to Sicily like Pyrrhus? Because he might, to get, consolidate naval bases, or he might march north. Now, if he does march north, I think he would win a lot of battles, no doubt about it. Pyrrhus won the first 2 engagements against the Romans. The issue is, though, could he have been in ambush in mountain passes? Could he have had his own Caudine forks where either Samnites or Romans ambush him? That's possible. And what would happen is we know against his uncle, Alexander of Epirus, who did fight the Samnites and died fighting them, saying that, my nephew fights women, I fight men. There is going to be a relatively high level of attrition that the Macedonians are going to receive that they didn't receive in the East. And I think that's going to be a real problem because as they start to bleed out people, the edge that Alexander has because of his elite troops is going to go down. Which means he'll have to recruit new troops, either from Asia or from Greece. And they won't be as well trained as the army he inherited from his father. It's going to be kind of like Napoleon after his defeat in Russia. He can still train new troops and he can still score victories, but it's not the Grand Army that invaded Russia. Those guys are all dead. And I think what would happen is Alexander would have this attrition where he's still winning battles, but he's losing too many guys. But the real decisive engagement would be maybe after 5 or 6 years. There's a naval battle somewhere in the Adriatic or off the coast of Sicily, and the Macedonians are just annihilated. Or maybe they're destroyed in a storm. I mean, the Romans in the First Punic War lost many of their ships to storms because they weren't seaworthy. They didn't know how to navigate at sea. Now, Rome had an institution, and they could just keep on cranking out fleets. Alexander and the Diadochi don't have that ability. They can't just roll out fleet after fleet after fleet. If you lose it, you lose it. It's over. Carthage could do it. Syracuse could do it. Rome later developed the ability to do that, but I don't think the Macedonians had that. And I think that's where it's going to be. Alexander's probably going to win on land most of the time. There might be a few setbacks. I mean, he is, the Roman system, I think, is still pretty strong, but it's at sea where I think he's going to lose. And then he's going to get stuck either in Italy or Africa, and there'll be some sort of negotiated settlement where he's allowed to leave with his troops on the condition that he doesn't come back. He still might come back later on. Who knows? And at the same time, especially if he's defeated at sea, I think there'll be rebellions in Asia. They're going to be like, okay, Alexander's stuck. It's let's go, boys. Let's consolidate it. Maybe some Persian satrap wants to restore the Achaemenid Empire. Maybe some Macedonian general tries to reassert his control over the area. And then even if Alexander does get out of the West in one piece, he'll have to put down all these rebellions throughout Asia. And I think that in all likelihood, he still might even just get poisoned or assassinated, just like his father did. So I think overall institutions are strong enough at this point that they would win, but the margin of their victory is a lot lower than it would be with Pyrrhus and Hannibal.
Yeah, those are some interesting points. I definitely agree. I mean, I think while Alexander does enjoy a slight edge on land, again, just due to veterancy and just general quality of his formations, yeah, I don't think that he would have the naval advantage at all. And he would, I mean, Alexander was an interesting sort of cult of personality in the sense that, if he saw another regional competitor, this again, like Persia, well, then he was going to war. However, I would tend to think that his generals would probably have advised him against some sort of direct conflict with Carthage, just due to, terrain like the Libyan desert, as well as, the problems of navigating the sea in these sort of long, drawn out ways, where the armies, if they had landed somewhere in Libya and were marching along it, well, they didn't have the best track record, like we discussed, like they did in southern Iran. One thing that I have thought about, and maybe this isn't the biggest variable, but it would play into it somehow, is that I'm curious to what extent Ptolemaic Egypt would have supported Alexander in this type of scenario with either men, ships, or gold. Ptolemaic Egypt at this point was fairly wealthy, and it's possible that he would have been supported in either some indirect or direct way. Although I'll say that the Ptolemy's dynasty was tricky in a way that he and his descendants were very opportunistic when it would often hold out in various scenarios to not get themselves directly tied into some long drawn out sort of conflict. And I'm just here alluding to the Diadochi Wars with Ptolemy's rule of Egypt. I also think it's possible too that, by the time that the Persians were conquered, Sicily had developed this reputation as sort of this Mediterranean breadbasket. And so I think it's possible that Alexander would have preferred to instead occupy some sort of eastern portion of Sicily without agitating the Carthaginians, but, maybe setting up various, port cities and things like that in Sicily, as sort of like a potentially happy middle ground between the Romans and the Greeks. But I could see a sort of a small occupation, like, the Greeks maintaining Neapolis, probably occupying a certain portion of Magna Graecia and possibly Sicily, and probably calling it good there, because he just cannot simply go toe-to-toe with either. Well, he definitely can't go toe-to-toe with Carthage, because Carthage has elephants as well, and they were able to draw resources and men from places like Corsica and Sardinia and Iberia and all these other places. So Carthage could raise an army too. They have that trick up their sleeve as well, and they might even have an easier time replenishing ranks than Alexander would, since he's again off on a foreign campaign. And again, the quality of Asiatic recruits was always less than homegrown Macedonians. And how long would these Macedonian formations last against more formidable Western enemies? I don't know, probably not that long. But that's kind of what I see as the possibility of there having, like, a partially occupied eastern Sicily, minimal naval engagements due to the fact that Macedonia just isn't up to the task against Carthage, and probably some sort of land holdings in Magna Graecia, as well as Neapolis, because even just before the Samnite Wars, Neapolis was a Greek city-state, or it was it was a Greek political entity.
Yeah. So, for example, if we look at the polyglot nature of the Carthaginian army, as we've discussed in the Greco-Punic Wars, unlike adding Asiatic troops like Alexander would have to do, they were actually quite effective warriors. They had the Balearic slingers, Celtic swordsmen, Bedouin cavalry, Numidian cavalry. I mean, these are competent military professionals that, yes, Persia does have a communications problem because of all these different people, but they can pull their weight. Like, they fight hard. They can score victories. Like at the Second Battle of Himera, it was the Celts that scored a victory for the Carthaginians. So is the Balearic slingers. So they have a lot of tools that they could use at their disposal. Plus, if it comes to bribing allies, Carthage has more money than anyone. Carthage has limitless, cash reserves. They could probably bribe the Asiatics to leave Alexander. You see, because if we look at Western Mediterranean conflict going back to 480 BC with the beginning of the Greco-Punic Wars, Western Mediterranean conflict is predominated by naval prowess. Rome only beat Carthage in the Second Punic War because it already had naval supremacy. And the question is, could Alexander have achieved a naval supremacy over Carthage, over Rome, and Syracuse is a bit of a wild card. I don't know which way they would have gone. They might have gone with Alexander. But if Alexander invades Sicily, they may or may not have sided with him. If they did, then that's a huge benefit to him. But as we saw with Rome in the First Punic War, to beat Carthage, you have to grind them down over decades. And there's just no way the Macedonians could grind down the Carthaginian navy. They didn't have the resources or the tools to do so. Neither did Syracuse. Only the later Roman Republic had those tools. On land, as we've read up to this point, whenever Rome is attacked, directly threatened either by Gauls or Samnites or Volscians, they fight like hellions. Like the Romans they devote themselves. They just say, okay, gods, I'm going to sacrifice myself for the greater good. Let's protect the city of Rome. Could Alexander have taken Rome? Yeah. The Celts did. But the point is, though, if he had done that, I think the Romans would have they would have raised the black flag. It would have been like the Taliban in Afghanistan today. Never surrendered, never quit. And in that case, I don't think Alexander could have held out. It would have been this persistent campaign of occupation. It would have been like Afghanistan, but worse, because the Romans had more of an organized defense system. It would have been like a quagmire almost if he'd moved into central Italy. And we also see that the Roman legion at this time, as we've talked about, was probably this transitional legion between Alia and Caudine Forks. So it is conceivable that the pressure of Alexander would have quickened that process to the actual manipular system we see with Polybius, much in the same way that the war with the Samnites quickened that transformation, which would have given Rome an upper hand. I think I'm going to go with Livy in the sense that systems beat the individual, and I think he's absolutely correct that Carthage would have been a Roman ally. They did the same thing against Pyrrhus. And I think an important thing to state, too, is at the beginning of paragraph 18, Livy writes, "We are now speaking of Alexander not yet intoxicated by prosperity, the seductions of which no man was less capable of withstanding. But if he is to be judged from the tenor of his conduct and the new state of his fortune, and from the new disposition, as I may say, which he put on after his successors, he would have entered Italy more like Darius than Alexander, and would have brought thither an army that had forgotten Macedonia, and were degenerating into the manner of the Persians. It is painful in speaking of so great a king to recite his ostentatious change of dress, of requiring that people should address him with adulation, prostrating themselves on the ground, a practice insupportable to the Macedonians, had they even been conquered, much more so when they were victorious. The shocking cruelty of his punishments, his murdering of friends in the midst of feasting and wine, with the folly of his fiction representing his birth. What must have been the consequence if his love of wine had daily become more intense, if his fierce and uncontrollable anger, and as I have mentioned, not any one circumstance of which there is doubt among writers, do we consider these as no disparagements to the qualifications of a commander." Exactly. What were you going to do with a sodden, Oriental Alexander? That's not the Alexander that landed at Ilium recapitulating Achilles.
Right. Yeah, those are definitely some interesting points. I think I agree with most of that. I think, just to restate it a bit here, I think that it would have been, regardless of the cult of personality, and I think some of the frustrations that he had generated is sort of in this far east of Central Asia, with some of his men and his commanders. I think had he recuperated for a year or two and sort of drawn some initial recruits from Macedonia and, put his army to at least 40 or 50,000. I think it's certainly possible that he could have maintained some holdings within Magna Graecia, and he probably could have taken Syracuse, or would have seen Syracuse as some type of ally, or could have gone all out war against Syracuse. I think he could have won as well. I think Livy is right in the sense that, Alexander wasn't around long enough to really have a lot of domestic issues, as well as facing really formidable enemies. So that is a good point. He's sort of drunk on his success of, conquering the world, it seems, speaking loosely here, but I think he probably would have limited his naval engagements as well with the Carthaginians. One thing that you said earlier is that, Carthage and Rome allied together during Pyrrhus, and that's certainly true. I guess my question with that is that I wonder to what extent that was just out of convenience, and was it just out of convenience itself, or was there something more there? That's definitely possible. I'm pretty open to that. I'm malleable, I suppose. But I wonder how long that alliance would last if there was sort of a Macedonian occupied lands in places like Sicily and Magna Graecia. I think that's an interesting one. I will say, though, one thing that I will say in Alexander's defense is that while there's sort of this stubborn defense of the Samnites in the way that they defend their mountainous regions, I think regardless of terrain and various settings, I think overall in terms of quality, I think Alexander's armies were of better quality, more well equipped, and had more tricks up their sleeves than the Samnites did. I think what the Samnites had was basically really advantageous land for their defense, and that's where they caught the Romans. I forget the name of the battle where they surrounded them basically on both sides of a smaller valley, and made them sort of do that. That's right, with the walk of shame and leaving their spears behind, and so on and so forth. But I think that's the one thing that the Samnites could really count on, was this mountainous terrain. I think had Alexander, if Alexander was fighting, say, someone like the Samnites or the Volscians in some sort of open field, well, I think Alexander's men are just Alexander's army just has they're more of a formidable enemy than the Samnites or the Volscians or some of these other various tribes, or the Gauls, because and just better equipment as well. But I think what I said earlier too, I think I'll just restate as well, is that I don't know that either one of these powers would just outright annihilate each other in some sort of swift campaign and like a small string of battles. What I see happening is that Alexander probably gets a few land holdings and probably gets his nose bloodied by Roman and potentially some sort of coalition, some coalition land battles, and there's some treaties are put in place, because I think he would have seen, after he sees some of the the systems at play and the architecture and the language and the religion, I think he would have seen those places as having some sort of figurative potential, and rather than destroying them and occupying them and so forth, I think he would see them as some sort of regional ally. And I think he probably would have thought the same of Carthage to some extent as well. So I think I'll leave it at that.
I think one thing that I want to add as well, for the analysis of this, if we look at the scorched earth policy of during the Second Punic War by Fabius Maximus against Hannibal in order to cut off Hannibal's supplies, the one way to defeat Alexander, and was Memnon, according to Arrian, the Greek mercenary general, told Darius to pursue a scorched, well, even not Darius, the satraps of Asia Minor, to pursue a scorched earth policy against Alexander, knowing that he couldn't feed the troops and that they would starve to death and die. And nobody listened. And then Darius didn't listen either. But that was the way you beat Alexander. And we know that's the way you beat him, because look at the debacle at the Judocian Desert. Carthage and Rome were not hampered by this sclerotic, degenerate, weak autocracy of Persia that wasn't going to, use scorched earth. They were more than happy to do that. I'm pretty sure we read with Diodorus Siculus when Agathocles invaded Africa, they pursued a scorched earth strategy. It's just what you do. And Carthage and Rome were more than willing to do that. I think what would have happened is Alexander would have been cut off at sea, and he would have been starving on the front. Now, he would win almost all the tactical engagements. I don't deny that. He would even take a lot of cities. But the grand strategy to defeat Alexander is to starve him out. Memnon was correct, and the Romans and the Carthaginians, I think, would have had a good sense to do that. And so, in all likelihood, cut off from supplies, Alexander would be pressured to negotiate a withdrawal or risk starving to death. And that's sort of what I would say is my final statement. Thanks again, Terminal Philosophy, for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.